What would you do if you discovered the one vulnerability that could change the course of the war, and your own commanders refused to listen? Imagine standing before one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany, armed with intelligence so critical it could save thousands of lives and countless aircraft, only to be dismissed, discredited, and silenced within 48 hours. This is not a hypothetical question. This is the true story of a man who saw what others refused to see, who spoke when silence would have been safer, and who paid the ultimate price for telling an inconvenient truth. In the winter of 1943, as Allied bombers carved burning paths through German cities night after night, one Luftwaffe officer made a discovery that should have altered the trajectory of the air war. He found the gaps, the blind spots in the radar network that could have given German night fighters the advantage they desperately needed. His name was Josef Kammhuber, though the man who brought his findings to Göring and faced the consequences was his chief of staff, a brilliant tactical mind named Wolfgang Falck. Together, they understood something that the upper echelons of Nazi leadership could not accept, that Germany was losing the technological war and that arrogance was proving more deadly than any Allied weapon. This is a story about courage, but not the kind celebrated in propaganda films. This is about the courage to challenge authority when authority has become delusional. It is about the terrible mathematics of warfare, where being right means nothing if those in power refuse to hear you. And it is about what happens when military necessity collides with political vanity, when truth becomes treason and silence becomes survival. The relevance of this story extends far beyond the smoking ruins of World War II Germany. It speaks to every moment in human history when those who see clearly are punished for their vision, when institutional inertia overwhelms tactical brilliance, and when pride determines strategy more than reason ever could. In the span of just 2 days, a man went from trusted advisor to dangerous liability, from decorated officer to silenced dissenter. What he discovered about British radar could have changed everything. What happened to him for making that discovery reveals the fatal flaw at the heart of the Nazi war machine and offers lessons that resonate through every conflict, every organization, every hierarchy that has ever existed. The skies over Europe in 1943 had become a realm of industrial-scale death, where technology and tactics evolved with terrifying speed, where yesterday's advantage became today's vulnerability, and where the price of falling behind was measured in burning cities and broken bodies. Into this maelstrom stepped men like Kammhuber and Falck, professionals who understood that warfare was not about ideology or will, but about cold calculations of capability and response. They were the technicians of death, yes, but also the guardians who stood between their people and annihilation. When they discovered that the shield protecting Germany had cracks, they faced a choice that defines moral courage: speak and face destruction, or remain silent and watch destruction unfold. To understand the magnitude of what happened in those 48 hours, we must first understand the sky over Europe in 1943. The air war had evolved into something unprecedented in human history, a three-dimensional battlefield where death arrived on screaming engines, where entire cities could be reduced to ash in a single night, and where technological advantage measured in mere seconds could mean the difference between devastating victory and catastrophic defeat. Hermann Göring, Reichsmarshal of the Greater German Reich and commander of the Luftwaffe, sat at the apex of this aerial empire. Born in 1893 to a family of minor Bavarian nobility, Göring had been a genuine hero of the First World War, a fighter ace credited with 22 victories, the last commander of the legendary Jagdgeschwader I, the flying circus once led by Manfred von Richthofen himself. But the man who ruled Germany's air forces in 1943 bore little resemblance to the lean, fierce pilot of 1918. Decades of morphine addiction following a war injury, combined with unlimited access to power and luxury, had transformed him into a grotesque parody of his former self. He weighed over 300 pounds, dressed in absurd uniforms of his own design, and surrounded himself with art looted from across conquered Europe. Yet Göring's physical decline paled in comparison to his intellectual deterioration. He had become a man who confused wishful thinking with strategic planning, who prioritized his standing with Hitler over the survival of his pilots, and who responded to failure not with analysis, but with rage. By 1943, as British Bomber Command and the American 8th Air Force intensified their campaigns, Göring's grasp on reality had become dangerously tenuous. He promised Hitler that no enemy bomber would ever reach Berlin. When they did, when they came in their hundreds night after night, Göring blamed his commanders, his pilots, even the German people themselves for lacking faith in the Luftwaffe's invincibility. Into this toxic environment came Josef Kammhuber, born in 1896, a career officer whose brilliant tactical mind had earned him command of Germany's night fighter forces in 1940. Kammhuber was everything Göring had once been, and no longer was. Clear-eyed, technically proficient, brutally honest about operational realities. Where Göring saw the air war through the lens of Nazi ideology and personal vanity, Kammhuber saw it as a problem to be solved through intelligence, organization, and technological innovation. The system Kammhuber created became known as the Kammhuber Line, a sophisticated defense network stretching from Denmark to Switzerland, divided into zones of radar coverage where German night fighters could be directed onto incoming bomber streams. Each zone, roughly 20 miles across, contained its own radar stations, fighter control centers, and searchlight batteries. It was ingenious, methodical, and for a time remarkably effective. British bombers entering German airspace found themselves tracked, intercepted, and destroyed with devastating efficiency. For months, bomber command losses climbed so high that the entire strategic bombing campaign teetered on the edge of cancellation. But Kammhuber understood something that Göring refused to accept. The British were learning, they were adapting, and most critically, they were finding the gaps. The moment that would lead to catastrophe came during a routine analysis in early 1943. Kammhuber's staff had been tracking the routes taken by British bomber streams, plotting them against the known coverage of the radar network. What they discovered should have triggered immediate alarm at every level of command. The British had identified corridors between the radar zones, spaces where German night fighters were effectively blind, where bombers could slip through undetected and unmolested. These weren't accidental gaps, they were being deliberately exploited, which meant British intelligence understood the German defensive system better than Göring did. Kammhuber knew what this meant. It meant that unless the radar network was expanded, unless additional night fighter squadrons were deployed, unless resources currently being wasted on Göring's vanity projects were redirected to actual defense, Germany would lose control of its own skies. The mathematics were simple and brutal. If British bombers could pass through German defenses with acceptable losses, they would keep coming, and they would reduce every German city to rubble. The choice Kammhuber faced was equally simple and equally brutal. Report these findings to Göring and risk his wrath, or stay silent and watch Germany burn. There was no middle ground, no diplomatic solution, no way to soften the message. The radar gaps existed. The British knew about them, and Göring's promises that the Luftwaffe would protect the Reich were being exposed as fantasy with every bomb that fell on German soil. The context of 1943, Germany adds layers of complexity to this dilemma. By this point in the war, the tide had turned decisively against the Third Reich. Stalingrad had fallen, with an entire German army destroyed or captured. The Afrika Korps was in retreat. Allied forces were preparing to invade Italy. On every front, German forces were being pushed back, outfought, outproduced, and overwhelmed. The myth of German invincibility, so carefully cultivated through years of rapid victories, had been shattered. What remained was a regime increasingly desperate, increasingly paranoid, and increasingly divorced from reality. In such an environment, bearers of bad news became indistinguishable from traitors. The Nazi leadership had constructed an ideological framework that could not accommodate failure without finding scapegoats. Every setback had to be explained as betrayal, sabotage, or insufficient commitment to National Socialist principles. The possibility that Allied forces were simply better organized, better equipped, or better led was ideologically unacceptable. To admit such things would be to admit that the entire racial hierarchy underpinning Nazi ideology was false, that German superiority was propaganda rather than reality, that the war might actually be lost. Kammhuber existed in the uncomfortable space between military professionalism and political necessity. He had sworn an oath to Hitler, as all German officers had, but his deeper loyalty was to Germany itself, to its people, its cities, its survival. He saw with perfect clarity that the gap between Nazi promises and Nazi performance was widening into an abyss that would swallow the nation. His night fighters were shooting down bombers, yes, but not enough bombers. His defensive network was functioning, yes, but not well enough. The trend lines were unmistakable. Without significant changes, Germany would lose the air war. And losing the air war meant losing the ability to produce weapons, to move supplies, to maintain any coherent defense. It meant total defeat. But presenting this analysis to Göring meant challenging not just a military assessment, but an entire worldview. It meant saying that the Reichsmarschall's public statements were false, that his strategic decisions were failing, that his leadership was inadequate. In a rational military organization, such assessments would be welcomed as necessary feedback, opportunities to correct course before disaster struck. In Nazi Germany, they were career-ending at best, life-ending at worst. Kammhuber made his choice. He prepared his report, gathered his evidence, and requested an audience with the Reichsmarschall. What he was about to do took more courage than flying into enemy fire ever had. He was going to tell Hermann Göring the truth. Understanding why this moment carried such devastating weight requires understanding how these men arrived at this collision point, how Germany's air defense had evolved from improvisation to sophistication, and how institutional culture had created conditions where truth became intolerable. Josef Kammhuber's journey to commanding Germany's night fighter force began not with glory, but with disaster. In May 1940, as Germany's blitzkrieg rolled through Belgium and France, Kammhuber was commanding a bomber unit when his aircraft was shot down over France. He was captured, spending weeks in a French prisoner of war camp before France's collapse freed him. That experience, the sudden, violent transition from predator to prey, from commander to captive, gave Kammhuber a perspective his peers lacked. He understood vulnerability. He knew what happened when tactical assumptions met combat reality. After his release, Hermann Göring personally selected Kammhuber to organize Germany's night fighter defenses, a task that initially seemed almost laughably simple. In 1940, the Luftwaffe possessed air superiority over most of Europe. British bombing raids were small, ineffective, and easily disrupted. The idea that enemy aircraft could pose a serious threat to the German homeland seemed remote, almost theoretical. Most Luftwaffe resources went to supporting ground operations, to preparing for the invasion of Britain, to maintaining the offensive posture that defined German military doctrine. But Kammhuber saw further. He understood that Britain's isolation across the Channel meant they would eventually make strategic bombing their primary offensive weapon. He recognized that night bombing, while currently ineffective due to navigation difficulties, would improve as technology advanced. Most importantly, he grasped that defensive systems needed to be built before they were urgently needed, that waiting until crisis arrived meant accepting defeat. With surprisingly limited resources, Kammhuber began constructing his defensive network. He studied British radar technology captured in France, analyzed after-action reports from night fighter engagements, and applied principles of industrial organization to aerial combat. The Kammhuber line emerged not from a single brilliant insight, but from methodical testing, continuous refinement, and willingness to acknowledge failures. When a tactic didn't work, Kammhuber changed it. When equipment proved inadequate, he demanded better. When crews struggled with intercept procedures, he redesigned the protocols. The system that resulted was remarkably sophisticated for its time. German radar operators would detect incoming bombers at ranges of 40 to 50 miles. Fighter controllers would calculate intercept vectors, directing night fighters, usually twin-engine Mi-110s or Ju-88s, toward their targets using running commentary transmitted by radio. As the fighter approached, its own airborne radar, the Liechtenstein system, would pick up the bomber at closer range, allowing the pilot to close for a visual attack. Searchlights would illuminate targets when weather permitted. The entire process, from initial detection to kill, could take as little as 10 minutes. The development of this system required solving countless technical and tactical problems. Early radar sets were unreliable, their displays difficult to interpret, their accuracy uncertain. Radio communications suffered from interference and limited range. Night fighter pilots, accustomed to daylight operations where visual contact was everything, had to learn entirely new skills: how to interpret radar operator instructions, how to use their own airborne radar effectively, how to approach targets in complete darkness without losing spatial orientation or colliding with friendly aircraft. Kammhuber approached these challenges with systematic rigor. He established training programs specifically for night operations, selecting pilots based on aptitude rather than seniority. He worked with engineers to improve radar reliability and display clarity. He created standardized procedures for intercept sequences, refining them based on operational experience. Most critically, he built a culture within his command that valued learning from failure, where pilots who lost targets were debriefed thoroughly, not to assign blame, but to identify system weaknesses. By 1942, this system was destroying British bombers at rates approaching 10% per mission, losses that, if sustained, would make strategic bombing unsustainable. Bomber Command's commander, Air Marshal Arthur Harris, faced mounting pressure to abandon night raids entirely. German cities remained relatively intact. The Luftwaffe's defensive victory seemed complete, but Kammhuber saw what others missed. He saw that each successful intercept generated data the British could analyze. He understood that the Kammhuber line's rigidity, each night fighter confined to a specific zone, waiting for targets to enter its assigned airspace, created predictable patterns an intelligent enemy could exploit. Most crucially, he recognized that the gaps between radar zones, initially acceptable when British raids involved dozens of aircraft, would become fatal vulnerabilities when raids involved hundreds. The gaps existed for practical reasons. Radar stations were expensive, required skilled operators, and consumed resources that were increasingly scarce as the war expanded on multiple fronts. The zones had been sized based on calculations of how quickly fighters could reach intercept positions, how long they could remain airborne, how many targets a single fighter could reasonably engage in one sortie. In the early war years, when British raids were small and scattered, these calculations made sense. A bomber stream entering one zone would be engaged by the fighters assigned to that zone. Even if some bombers escaped, losses would be high enough to make the raids ineffective. But British tactics were evolving. They began concentrating their forces, sending hundreds of bombers through single zones in tight time windows, overwhelming the limited number of fighters available in that zone. They varied their routes, sometimes feinting toward one zone before turning to exploit another. They improved their electronic countermeasures, jamming German radar and communications. And they began mapping the defensive network systematically, identifying through trial and error where coverage was strong and where it was weak. Kammhuber's analysis in early 1943 revealed that the British had achieved something remarkable. They had effectively reverse-engineered the Kammhuber line. Through careful observation of where they encountered heavy fighter opposition and where they did not, through signals intelligence that intercepted German radio traffic, through interrogation of downed Luftwaffe crew members, British intelligence had mapped the entire defensive network. They knew where the radar stations were located. They knew the approximate boundaries of each zone. Most damaging of all, they knew where the gaps were, the corridors between zones where transitioning bombers might encounter reduced coverage, where overlapping radar coverage created confusion rather than redundancy, where fighter control became ambiguous. This intelligence was being operationally exploited. British bombers were being routed specifically to take advantage of these weaknesses. The loss rates that had briefly threatened to make strategic bombing untenable were declining. German night fighter pilots reported that bombers seemed to be avoiding their zones, that intercepts were becoming less frequent, that the enemy appeared to know exactly where German defenses were strongest and weakest. Kammhuber tried to warn Göring. In meeting after meeting, he presented evidence, projections, tactical analyses. He argued for expansion of the radar network, for flexible command structures that could concentrate fighters at the point of attack rather than distributing them evenly along the entire defensive line, for investment in improved radar technology and more night fighter production. Some requests were granted grudgingly, others ignored entirely, still more rejected out of hand because they contradicted Göring's public statements about the Luftwaffe's invincibility. The institutional culture Kammhuber navigated had become toxic in ways that extended beyond Göring's personal failings. The entire Nazi military system operated on principles of unquestioning obedience, Führer worship, and the suppression of horizontal communication between commanders. Officers who succeeded were those who told their superiors what they wanted to hear, who promised victory regardless of reality, who blamed failures on subordinates or external enemies rather than acknowledging systemic problems. Independent thought was tolerated only when it produced results that confirmed existing narratives. When it challenged those narratives, it became insubordination. Kammhuber existed in a peculiar position within this system. His successes, the bombers shot down, the raids disrupted, gave him credibility that protected him from the worst consequences of his honesty. But that protection was conditional, temporary, dependent on continuing success. The moment his defensive system failed conspicuously, the moment British bombers reached their targets in force, despite the Kammhuber line, that protection would evaporate. The contradiction at the heart of Kammhuber's position was this: the only way to prevent eventual catastrophic failure was to acknowledge current partial failure and demand resources to address it. But acknowledging partial failure in Nazi Germany's command structure meant accepting blame, which meant losing the authority and resources needed to fix the problems. It was a trap without escape, a logical impossibility enforced by institutional culture. Wolfgang Falck embodied similar contradictions. Born in 1910, Falck had been among the first pilots trained in night fighting techniques, effectively inventing many of the tactics that made the Kammhuber line possible. He was a pure professional, a man who cared about technical excellence, operational effectiveness, and the survival of his pilots. He had no particular loyalty to Nazi ideology. His loyalty was to Germany, to the Luftwaffe as an institution, and to the men under his command. This made him both invaluable and dangerous. Invaluable because his expertise was genuine and desperately needed. Dangerous because his priorities did not align with the regime's political imperatives. Falck and Kammhuber shared an understanding that transcended their official roles. They both knew that Germany was losing the war. Not might lose, not could lose if things went badly, was losing. Present progressive tense, inevitable trajectory toward total defeat. They saw it in the statistics, in the operational reports, in the gap between German production capacity and Allied production capacity. They understood that the only question remaining was how long the war would last and how much of Germany would be destroyed before it ended. This knowledge created an ethical imperative. If defeat was inevitable, then the duty of military professionals shifted from pursuing impossible victory to minimizing damage, protecting their people, preserving what could be preserved. This meant being honest about capabilities and limitations. It meant not wasting resources on pointless offensives. It meant building defenses even though defenses implied acknowledgement that Germany could no longer attack effectively. It meant telling the truth even when truth was unwelcome. So Kammhuber did what he could with what he had. He optimized, improvised, and adapted. He trained his crews to exceptional standards. He pushed his staff to extract maximum efficiency from limited resources. He hoped that his results would speak for themselves. That demonstrated competence would eventually overcome institutional resistance to uncomfortable truths. He was wrong. In July 1943, British Bomber Command launched Operation Gomorrah, a series of massive raids on Hamburg. Using a new technology called window, strips of aluminum foil that created false radar returns, the British rendered the Kammhuber line's radar systems nearly useless. German night fighters groped blindly through skies filled with thousands of phantom targets, while real bombers flew unmolested overhead. Hamburg burned. 40,000 civilians died in the firestorms. The Kammhuber line, Germany's great technological achievement in air defense, had been defeated by what amounted to aluminum foil dropped from bomber bays. The Hamburg raids demonstrated with terrible clarity everything Kammhuber had been warning about. The defensive system was not robust. It could not adapt to countermeasures. It lacked redundancy and flexibility. The British had found not just the gaps in radar coverage, but a way to render the entire radar network useless. And Germany had no backup plan, no alternative defensive strategy, no way to protect its cities when the primary system failed. Göring's response was predictable. He blamed Kammhuber. The system had failed, therefore its architect must be incompetent or disloyal, possibly both. The fact that Kammhuber had been warning about exactly this kind of vulnerability for months was irrelevant. The fact that British scientists had developed a countermeasure that would have defeated any radar-based system was irrelevant. The fact that proper resource allocation might have created redundant systems or alternative tactics was irrelevant. What mattered was that Göring needed someone to blame and Kammhuber was conveniently available. But before Göring could remove him, Kammhuber made one final attempt to save Germany's air defense and sealed his fate in the process. The confrontation that followed involves themes that transcend the specific circumstances of World War II Germany. It reveals fundamental tensions that exist in any hierarchical organization facing existential crisis, any institution where authority depends on maintaining illusions, any system where messengers bearing bad news become more threatening than the threats they describe. First among these themes is the concept of institutional fragility masquerading as strength. The Nazi state projected absolute power, total control, inevitable victory. Its visual language, the massive rallies, the stark uniforms, the monumental architecture, conveyed permanence and invincibility. But beneath this facade lay desperate fragility. The regime's authority rested not on consent or even on effective governance, but on maintaining the appearance of infallibility. Every failure had to be explained away, recontextualized, blamed on saboteurs or traitors, or the inherent inferiority of enemies who somehow kept winning. This created a paradox at the system's core. The stronger the regime appeared, the more threatened it felt by evidence of weakness. A truly strong institution can acknowledge failures, learn from them, and adapt. The Nazi regime could do none of these things. Its ideology required continuous victory, demanded that setbacks be temporary aberrations rather than systemic problems, insisted that any suggestion of fundamental weakness was enemy propaganda or defeatism. This meant that the very intelligence needed to address problems became too dangerous to acknowledge. Kammhuber's radar gap analysis struck at the heart of this paradox. The gaps were real. Bombers were exploiting them, German cities were burning, civilian casualties were mounting. But acknowledging the gaps meant acknowledging that Göring's promises were false, that British technology and tactics were superior, that Germany might actually lose the air war. These acknowledgements were intolerable, not because they were wrong, but because they were right. Truth had become the enemy. The second theme concerns the transformation of competence into liability. In functional organizations, skilled professionals who identify problems are valued resources. Their expertise enables institutional improvement, their warnings prevent disasters, their analysis guides strategy. But in dysfunctional organizations, especially those gripped by crisis and ideological rigidity, competent professionals become threats. They see too clearly, speak too honestly, refuse to participate in collective delusion. Their very competence makes them dangerous because it reveals the incompetence of those above them. Kammhuber embodied this transformation. His technical expertise, once prized, became a liability the moment it produced conclusions that contradicted official narratives. His honesty, once appreciated as professional integrity, became insubordination when it challenged authority. His concern for the survival of Germany and its cities became defeatism when it implied that current strategies were failing. The qualities that made him an effective commander, analytical rigor, intellectual independence, commitment to objective reality, became the reasons he had to be silenced. This dynamic plays out across history and across organizational types. Scientists who warn about climate change are attacked as alarmists. Economists who predict financial crises are dismissed as pessimists. Engineers who identify safety flaws are labeled obstructionists. In each case, the competence that enables accurate prediction becomes the reason to ignore the prediction. Organizations prefer comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths, and they punish those who insist on truth. The third theme involves the terrible calculus of moral courage in corrupt systems. Kammhuber faced a choice that confronts ethical people in unethical organizations: speak truth and face consequences, or remain silent and preserve the ability to do some good within the system. Neither option is satisfactory. Speaking truth might lead to removal from any position of influence, leaving the problem unfixed and the truth teller powerless. But remaining silent means becoming complicit in the institutional failure, watching preventable disasters unfold, living with the knowledge that your silence enabled harm. This dilemma has no clean solution. Those who speak often accomplish nothing beyond their own martyrdom. Those who stay silent preserve influence, but at the cost of integrity. The choice between futile honesty and effective complicity is one of the cruelest that circumstances can impose. It reveals the moral bankruptcy of systems that force such choices, that make doing the right thing incompatible with doing effective things. Kammhuber chose to speak. He chose to present his findings to Göring despite knowing the likely response. This was not naive idealism. He understood exactly what he was risking, but he also understood that the alternative was moral abdication, that remaining silent when silence meant death for his pilots and destruction for his country was a line he could not cross. His choice reflects a particular form of courage rarely celebrated: the courage to lose, to sacrifice position and influence for principle, to accept that sometimes the right action leads to defeat. The fourth theme concerns the relationship between technological systems and human judgment. The Kammhuber line was a technical marvel, a sophisticated integration of radar, radio communication, fighter aircraft, and ground control that represented the cutting edge of military technology. But its effectiveness depended entirely on human decisions about how to employ it, how to adapt it, how to resource it. Technology alone solves nothing. It merely provides tools that human wisdom or human folly can use well or badly. Göring saw the Kammhuber line as a fixed achievement, a system that worked and therefore required no further attention or resources. Kammhuber saw it as a dynamic process requiring constant evolution, a race between German defensive innovation and Allied offensive innovation that Germany was beginning to lose. The technological system was identical in both perspectives, but the understanding of what that technology meant and what it required were radically different. Göring's failure was not a failure of technology, but a failure of wisdom, the inability to see that even the most sophisticated system becomes obsolete the moment you stop improving it. This pattern repeats in every domain where technology mediates human activity. Organizations invest heavily in creating systems, then treat those systems as permanent solutions rather than temporary advantages. They fail to recognize that any competitive advantage attracts countermeasures, that static defense guarantees eventual defeat, that survival requires continuous adaptation. The technology becomes a security blanket, creating false confidence that blinds leadership to emerging vulnerabilities. The fifth theme addresses prediction and prevention in catastrophic failure. Kammhuber saw Hamburg coming, not the specific attack, not the exact date, but the inevitability that British countermeasures would eventually overwhelm German defenses if those defenses were not continuously enhanced. He tried to prevent this catastrophe through warning, through requesting resources, through making the case that prevention now was cheaper than recovery later. His warnings were ignored and Hamburg burned. This pattern repeats throughout history with depressing regularity. Financial analysts warn about housing bubbles, and regulators ignore them until markets collapse. Engineers warn about O-ring failures in cold weather, and managers ignore them until shuttles explode. Intelligence analysts warn about terrorist threats, and bureaucracies ignore them until towers fall. In each case, the expert who sees disaster approaching is ignored, discounted, or actively suppressed. Then disaster strikes, the expert is briefly vindicated, and the institutional response is to blame the expert for not being persuasive enough, rather than examining why institutions are structured to reject warning. The underlying problem is epistemological and psychological. Warnings about future disasters require present action and present sacrifice. They demand that resources be diverted from visible current needs to address invisible future risks. They require acknowledging that current approaches are inadequate. These demands conflict with cognitive biases that privilege immediate concerns over distant threats, that prefer certainty to probability, that resist changing course once committed. Institutions amplify these biases through bureaucratic inertia, political calculation, and the distribution of costs and benefits across different stakeholders. Preventing catastrophic failure requires overcoming all these obstacles. It requires institutional cultures that take warnings seriously, that investigate rather than dismiss, that allocate resources based on risk assessment rather than political convenience. Creating such cultures is difficult because it runs counter to normal human psychology and organizational dynamics. The fact that it is difficult does not make it less necessary. The sixth theme concerns the relationship between authority and expertise. In military organizations, this relationship is supposedly clear. Authority flows from rank, expertise advises authority, and proper decision-making integrates both hierarchical prerogatives and technical knowledge. But this ideal breaks down when authority becomes detached from reality, when leaders surround themselves with sycophants rather than experts, when expertise that contradicts preferred narratives is suppressed. Göring possessed ultimate authority over the Luftwaffe. His rank, his political position, his personal relationship with Hitler gave him unchallenged power to make decisions and allocate resources, but he lacked expertise in modern air warfare. His understanding of aerial combat was frozen in 1918, based on experiences that bore little resemblance to the technological industrial warfare of 1943. His strategic judgment was compromised by drug addiction, by political considerations, by pathological narcissism. He was precisely the wrong person to be making critical decisions about Germany's air defense. Kammhuber possessed expertise but limited authority. He could advise, recommend, and implement orders, but he could not compel allocation of resources or override strategic decisions made at higher levels. His expertise should have been his authority's greatest asset. Instead, it became a threat because it revealed authority's inadequacy. Functional institutions create mechanisms to ensure that expertise informs authority, that leaders are forced to confront evidence even when uncomfortable, that decisions are made based on analysis rather than whim. Nazi Germany lacked any such mechanisms. Authority was absolute, expertise was conditional, and the gap between them became a chasm that swallowed the nation. Finally, there is the theme of systemic learning failure. Organizations survive through learning, adapting to changing circumstances, incorporating new information, abandoning approaches that stop working. This requires feedback mechanisms that allow information to flow from operational levels to strategic levels, that enable honest assessment of failures, that reward innovation and adaptation. The Nazi system had destroyed its own feedback mechanisms. Fear of punishment meant that negative information was filtered, sanitized, or suppressed before reaching decision-makers. Political considerations determined what could be said more than operational realities. Ideology provided ready-made explanations for every failure, eliminating the need for analysis. The result was an organization that could not learn, that kept repeating failed approaches because acknowledging failure was too dangerous. This learning failure manifested across the entire German war effort. Tactics that worked in 1940 were still being employed in 1944 despite radically changed circumstances. Production priorities reflected political prestige rather than military necessity. Resources were wasted on wonder weapons that could never be produced in sufficient quantity, while practical improvements to existing systems were neglected. The entire apparatus became increasingly divorced from reality, increasingly incapable of adapting to setbacks, increasingly locked into patterns that guaranteed eventual defeat. Kammhuber's warning about radar gaps was one small example of a much larger pathology. Even if his specific warning had been heeded, even if radar coverage had been improved and tactics adapted, the fundamental problem would have remained. Germany had created a system that could not learn, could not adapt, could not acknowledge reality. Such systems can win through initial advantages, but they cannot sustain success against adaptive opponents. They are inherently brittle, and when they break catastrophically. The meeting took place at Göring's headquarters at Karinhal, his vast estate north of Berlin, named after his first wife and filled with art stolen from museums across occupied Europe. The estate itself was a monument to Göring's grotesque excess, lakes and forests maintained for his private hunting, buildings decorated in a bizarre mixture of styles reflecting his megalomania, quarters for servants and guards to maintain the fantasy that he was some kind of feudal lord, rather than a jumped-up thug who happened to be close to an even more dangerous thug. The man who presented Kammhuber's findings was Wolfgang Falck, the founding father of German night fighter forces, a decorated pilot who had personally developed many of the tactics the Kammhuber line employed. Falck carried with him detailed maps showing bomber routes, radar coverage areas, and most damning of all, the gaps, the corridors where British aircraft flew unmolested through what was supposed to be an impenetrable defensive network. He had statistical analyses showing that British exploitation of these gaps was systematic and increasing, that bomber streams were being deliberately routed to avoid the strongest parts of German defenses, that loss rates were declining precisely because the British had mapped German capabilities. What Falck expected was a difficult conversation. What he got was theater of the absurd, a glimpse into the delusional mindset that would ultimately doom Germany to total defeat. Göring began by dismissing the evidence before hearing it. The Kammhuber line, he declared, was functioning perfectly. British losses were catastrophic. He had reports proving it. Any suggestion that bombers were exploiting gaps was British propaganda, designed to demoralize German defenders and fool German commanders into doubting their own systems. Falck's maps, he suggested without actually examining them, were probably based on British disinformation, perhaps even fabricated by defeatists within the Luftwaffe itself. This opening salvo revealed something important. Göring was not interested in information. He had already decided what the truth was, and any evidence contradicting that truth would be rejected regardless of its quality or source. This was not a military briefing. It was a ritual of power assertion, where the Reichsmarshal would demonstrate his authority by crushing dissent and demanding agreement with his preconceived conclusions. Falck persisted. He explained how the analysis had been conducted, how bomber routes had been plotted against verified radar coverage, how the gaps were not theoretical, but demonstrated by British aircraft actually reaching their targets with decreasing losses. He pointed out that Hamburg had been devastated precisely because the British had found these gaps, because Window had exploited the limitations Kammhuber had been warning about for months, because the defensive system lacked the flexibility and redundancy needed to cope with adaptive opponents. As Falck spoke, Göring's expression shifted from dismissal to irritation to barely controlled rage. Here was a subordinate, a mere colonel, daring to contradict the Reichsmarshal's assessment, daring to suggest that official statements about the Luftwaffe's defensive success were inaccurate, daring to imply that Göring himself bore responsibility for the burning of German cities. The substance of Falck's presentation became irrelevant. What mattered was the insubordination, the challenge to authority, the refusal to accept that Göring's word defined reality. Göring's response escalated from dismissal to rage. He accused Kammhuber, and by extension Falck, of defeatism, of making excuses for failure, of lacking faith in German technical superiority. The problem, Göring insisted, was not gaps in radar coverage, but cowardice among night fighter pilots, insufficient aggression, failure to press attacks. If British bombers were reaching their targets, it was because German pilots were not doing their jobs, were perhaps even deliberately avoiding combat to undermine the Reich. He suggested that what Germany needed was not more radar stations or different tactics, but more fighting spirit, more commitment to National Socialist principles, more willingness to sacrifice. This accusation that pilots were cowards crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Falck had flown combat missions throughout the war, had seen friends die, had watched as inadequate equipment and impossible demands cost lives. The night fighter crews were not cowards. They were heroes flying obsolete aircraft with inadequate support against overwhelming odds, and they were dying in droves because commanders like Göring refused to acknowledge reality, refused to provide proper resources, refused to adapt tactics to changing circumstances. The accusation revealed something profound about Göring's worldview. In his understanding, warfare was fundamentally about will, German will versus enemy will, with victory going to whoever wanted it more desperately. Technology, tactics, logistics, all these were secondary to the spiritual dimension of combat. This was pure Nazi ideology, the belief that Aryan superiority manifested primarily in superior will and fighting spirit, that material disadvantages could be overcome through commitment and sacrifice. This worldview was not just wrong, but dangerously wrong. It meant that every failure could be reinterpreted as insufficient commitment rather than inadequate resources or flawed strategy. It created an infinite feedback loop, where defeats generated demands for greater sacrifice, which generated more defeats, which generated demands for even greater sacrifice, spiraling toward total exhaustion and collapse. It made learning impossible because it provided a ready explanation for every setback that required no analysis, no adaptation, no acknowledgement of limitations. Falck understood this. He understood that arguing with Göring about radar gaps was pointless because Göring's framework had no conceptual space for the argument Falck was making. In Göring's reality, German defenses were adequate and any failures were due to human weakness. Presenting evidence of systemic vulnerabilities was not just disagreement, it was denial of the ideological principles that justified Nazi rule. But Falck had not come this far to accept comfortable lies. He had seen too many of his pilots die, had watched too many cities burn, had spent too many nights calculating loss rates, and knowing that without changes, the losses would continue to mount until there were no pilots left, no fighters left, no cities left. He had made a decision before arriving at Karenhall that if Göring refused to hear the truth diplomatically, then Falck would deliver it bluntly, and consequences be damned. So Falck said what needed to be said. He told Göring that the pilots were doing everything humanly possible with what they had been given. He said the real failure was at command level, the refusal to allocate resources to defense, the obsession with offensive operations that no longer served any strategic purpose, the inability to acknowledge that Britain and America were outproducing Germany in aircraft, in pilots, in technology, in every dimension of aerial warfare. He pointed out that Göring had promised Hitler that enemy bombers would never reach Berlin, that this promise had been proven false repeatedly, that continuing to deny obvious reality was not policy, but delusion that would cost Germany everything. He went further. He said that every night fighter pilot who died flying inadequate missions with inadequate support was dying not for Germany, but for Göring's vanity, for the Reichsmarschall's inability to admit mistakes to Hitler, for a system that valued appearances over substance. He said that Hamburg's dead, 40,000 civilians burned alive, were Göring's responsibility, killed by the defensive failures that Kammhuber had warned about, and Göring had ignored. The room went silent. In Nazi Germany, you did not speak to a Reichsmarschall this way. You did not call his judgment delusional. You did not publicly contradict his statements or question his decisions. You did not accuse him of responsibility for German deaths. Doing so was not merely insubordinate, it was politically suicidal, possibly literally suicidal, given the regime's propensity for executing those deemed defeatist or treasonous. The other officers present, Göring's staff, sycophants who had learned that survival meant agreement, looked at Falck with horror. Some might have admired his courage. All understood that they were witnessing a man destroying his career, possibly his life, for the sake of speaking truth that would change nothing. Göring had the power. Göring made the decisions, and Göring would respond to this challenge the only way he knew how, by crushing it. Göring did not explode into immediate rage, which might almost have been better. Instead, his response was cold, calculated, and utterly final. He thanked Falck for his report. He said that Kammhuber's analysis would be given the consideration it deserved. He suggested that perhaps both Kammhuber and Falck might benefit from some time away from operational command, time to regain perspective, to recover from the evident strain of their duties, to remember the principles of loyalty and obedience that bound the Luftwaffe together. The phrasing was bureaucratic, almost polite. The meaning was crystal clear. Falck and Kammhuber were finished. Their careers, their ability to influence air defense strategy, their protection within the system, all of it was being stripped away as punishment for the crime of being right at the wrong time. The meeting ended. Falck left Karen Hall knowing exactly what he had done and what would follow. He had told the truth to a man who could not hear truth, had challenged authority that could not tolerate challenge, had tried to save lives by providing information that would be used to destroy him rather than to address the problems he had identified. He had gambled everything on the possibility that Göring might, confronted with undeniable evidence, choose Germany's survival over his own ego. He had lost that gamble, but the loss did not make the gamble wrong. Sometimes courage means accepting certain defeat for the sake of refusing to lie, refusing to participate in collective delusion, refusing to be complicit in preventable disaster. Falck's courage in that moment was not the courage of battlefield heroics or daring tactics. It was the quieter, harder courage of integrity, of being willing to sacrifice everything for principle, knowing the sacrifice would accomplish nothing. Within 48 hours, the consequences materialized with bureaucratic efficiency. Kammhuber was removed from command of 14th Fliegerkorps, the night fighter forces he had built from nothing. He was transferred to command Luftflotte 5 in Norway, a backwater theater where the war had already been decided, where his expertise in air defense would be wasted defending empty skies against non-existent threats. The assignment was a classic bureaucratic punishment, not dismissal, not court-martial, but exile to irrelevance where he could do no harm to Göring's narratives and no good for Germany's defense. Falck was likewise removed from operational command. He was reassigned to training duties, tasked with instructing new pilots in techniques he would no longer be able to employ operationally, forced to watch from the sidelines as the defensive system he had helped create collapsed under exactly the pressures he had warned about. His removal was quieter than Kammhuber's, less visible, but equally effective at silencing his voice and neutralizing his influence. Other officers in Kammhuber's command who had participated in the radar gap analysis were quietly reassigned, scattered to different commands where they could not collaborate or continue their work. The institutional knowledge they had built, the understanding of British tactics, the statistical analysis of defensive effectiveness, the identification of systemic vulnerabilities, was deliberately dispersed and lost. It was not enough to silence the men who had discovered uncomfortable truths. The truths themselves had to be suppressed, the evidence scattered, the analysis made unavailable to those who might act on it. The radar gap analysis itself, the maps, the statistical data, the tactical assessments, disappeared into files marked classified or secret, never to be acted upon. Instead, Göring convened his own inquiry into night fighter effectiveness, carefully staffed by officers who understood what conclusions were expected of them. This inquiry determined, predictably, that the Kammhuber line was functioning superbly within its design parameters, that any failures resulted from insufficient pilot aggression or temporary equipment problems, that British successes were due to overwhelming numbers rather than exploitation of German weaknesses, and that no fundamental changes to defensive strategy were required or justified. The inquiry's conclusions were politically perfect and operationally catastrophic. They absolved Göring of responsibility, confirmed Nazi ideological assumptions about willpower trumping material factors, and required no admission of error or change of approach. They also guaranteed that the defensive failures would continue and worsen, that British bombers would keep exploiting the gaps that officially did not exist, that German cities would keep burning while Göring blamed everyone except himself. Germany's air defense did not improve. Instead, it collapsed. British and American bombers came in ever larger formations, exploiting the gaps that officially did not exist, using tactics and technologies that German defenses could not counter. The night fighter force continued to fly, continued to fight, continued to die. Between 1943 and 1945, thousands of German night fighter crew members were killed. Most died not because they lacked skill or courage, but because the system they defended was fundamentally broken, and the men who could have fixed it had been silenced for trying. German cities burned one after another: Hamburg, Berlin, Dresden, Cologne, Munich, Nuremberg, Frankfurt. The firestorms consumed not just buildings, but lives, culture, history. Hundreds of thousands of civilians died. Children were incinerated in their beds. Families suffocated in cellars. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to ash and rubble in single nights. The promise that the Luftwaffe would protect the homeland was revealed as a cruel lie, and the lie was maintained through every disaster, through every failure, until there was nothing left to protect. The silencing of Kammhuber's radar gap analysis was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern that characterized Nazi Germany's military decline and offers lessons far beyond the specific circumstances of the Second World War. Understanding this pattern requires examining how it manifested in other contexts and what it reveals about institutional failure under pressure. Consider the parallel case of Erwin Rommel in North Africa. Rommel repeatedly warned his superiors that without adequate fuel supplies, without reinforcements, without air superiority, his forces could not hold their positions against British and American offensives. His requests for resources were denied, his warnings characterized as pessimism or excuse-making, his tactical genius wasted because strategic realities made victory impossible. When Allied forces launched Operation Torch and the tide turned definitively against German forces in North Africa, Rommel was blamed for the defeat, the very defeat he had predicted and tried to prevent. Like Kammhuber, he discovered that being right was no protection against institutional need for scapegoats. That expertise made him a convenient target rather than a valued resource. Or examine the case of German intelligence officers who warned in 1944 that Allied forces were preparing a massive invasion of France, that the Atlantic Wall fortifications were inadequate, that beach defenses would be overwhelmed by the kind of combined arms assault that Allied doctrine emphasized. Hitler and his inner circle were so committed to their belief that the invasion would come at Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the Channel, the most obvious route, that they ignored intelligence indicating Normandy as the actual target. Even after D-Day landings began at Normandy, Hitler insisted for crucial hours that this was a feint, that the real invasion would still come at Calais, that German reserves should be held back rather than committed to repelling what was obviously the main Allied effort. The result was catastrophic. German forces were positioned wrong, their reserves held back by direct order from Hitler, their defensive preparations concentrated in the wrong locations. When they finally were released to counterattack, it was too late. Allied forces had established secure beachheads, were bringing in overwhelming numbers of men and equipment, had achieved the foothold that would lead inexorably to Germany's defeat. The intelligence officers who had been right about Allied intentions received no credit for their foresight. They were simply ignored, their accurate predictions treated as irrelevant once events had proven them correct. This pattern of ignoring expertise and punishing accuracy extended beyond military operations into economic and industrial planning. German engineers and economists repeatedly warned that the Reich's economic model was unsustainable, that conquered territories could not be plundered indefinitely, that industrial production required rational allocation of resources rather than competing fiefdoms answering to different Nazi leaders. Albert Speer, appointed armaments minister in 1942, spent much of his tenure fighting against irrational economic policies driven by political considerations rather than production efficiency. Speer discovered that multiple agencies were independently ordering production of similar items, creating redundancy and waste, that political criteria, rather than technical merit, determined which weapons systems were developed and deployed. That Nazi racial ideology prevented full mobilization of German women into factory work, leaving crucial labor resources unutilized while importing foreign workers who were deliberately maltreated and therefore less productive. That Hitler's obsession with certain wonder weapons, the V1 and V2 rockets for instance, consumed resources that could have produced thousands of conventional weapons with far greater military impact. These warnings were acknowledged when convenient and ignored when they contradicted political imperatives. Speer managed to achieve remarkable increases in German production despite Allied bombing, despite resource constraints, despite the irrational system he worked within. But he could not fix the fundamental problems because those problems were features rather than bugs. They reflected the nature of Nazi governance, where power was deliberately fragmented to prevent anyone except Hitler from controlling complete systems, where ideology trumped efficiency, where political reliability mattered more than technical competence. The systematic rejection of expertise in favor of ideology was not merely a Nazi phenomenon. It represents a universal failure mode of institutions under stress, particularly authoritarian institutions that derive legitimacy from claims of infallibility. When external pressures mount, when previous strategies stop working, when reality begins to contradict comfortable assumptions, institutions face a choice: adapt by acknowledging problems and changing course, or double down on existing approaches by denying problems exist. Authoritarian systems almost inevitably choose the latter because adaptation requires admitting previous errors, and admitting errors undermines the claim to infallible leadership that justifies authoritarian control. If the great leader or the party or the Führer can be wrong about major decisions, then what justifies their absolute power? If expertise matters more than ideological purity, then why should technical experts defer to political leaders? The entire structure of authority depends on maintaining the fiction that those at the top know best, that their judgment is superior, that disagreement represents either ignorance or disloyalty. Democratic systems are not immune to this failure mode, but they possess mechanisms that authoritarian systems lack: opposition parties that benefit from exposing failures, free press that investigates official narratives, elections that punish leaders who ignore reality, courts that can challenge executive decisions. These mechanisms are imperfect. Democratic societies certainly make catastrophic mistakes, but they create spaces where uncomfortable truths can surface and potentially be acted upon. When American intelligence failed to predict the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, investigations followed. Officers were questioned, procedures were examined, lessons were documented. Some careers were damaged, but the institutional response was primarily to learn from failure, rather than to punish messengers or deny that failure had occurred. When British bombing strategy proved less effective than claimed, particularly the controversial area bombing of German cities, policy eventually shifted, based on operational research and strategic reassessment. Not quickly, not perfectly, but eventually. The difference was not that democratic systems were inherently wiser, but that they had mechanisms for error correction. They could absorb negative information without threatening the system's legitimacy. They could change course without leaders losing face. They could debate strategy and tactics without such debates being treated as challenges to fundamental authority. These capabilities are procedural rather than moral. They are about how systems process information and make decisions, not about whether individual leaders are good or bad people. Nazi Germany lacked any such mechanisms. There was no loyal opposition, no free press, no electoral accountability, no independent courts. There was only hierarchy, ideology, and terror. Speak truth that contradicted official narratives, and you risked not just your career, but your life. The regime executed thousands of Germans for defeatism, for saying in private conversations that Germany might lose the war, even when Germany obviously was losing the war, even when anyone with eyes could see cities in ruins and armies in retreat. In such an environment, the surprising thing is not that experts like Kammhuber were silenced, but that they spoke up at all. The rational calculus suggested silence. Stay quiet, preserve your position, do what limited good you can within the constraints of an insane system. The fact that some officers chose instead to speak truth, knowing the likely consequences, knowing that speaking would probably accomplish nothing, reflects a particular form of moral courage that deserves recognition precisely because it was futile. The radar gap case also illuminates the specific technological and tactical dynamics of the air war, revealing how narrow the margins were between success and failure, how rapidly advantage could shift, and how much depended on institutional ability to recognize and respond to change. When Kammhuber built his defensive line in 1940 and 1941, he was working at the cutting edge of military technology. Radar itself was barely a decade old, its military applications only beginning to be understood. The idea of ground-controlled interception, using radar to detect enemy aircraft, radio to direct friendly fighters, coordination between multiple sites to create interlocking coverage, was novel, untested, requiring entirely new organizational structures and training methods. The integration of ground radar, airborne radar, radio communication, searchlights, flak batteries, and fighter aircraft into a coherent system was an extraordinary technical and organizational achievement. For a time, the system worked brilliantly. British bomber crews reported terrifying experiences of being hunted through dark skies by invisible pursuers who seemed to know exactly where they were, who appeared from nowhere with uncanny precision, who pressed attacks with skill and determination. Loss rates climbed toward levels that would make sustained operations impossible. The RAF's Bomber Command faced an existential crisis. Billions of pounds invested in strategic bombing capacity, thousands of trained crew members, an entire strategic doctrine premised on the ability to strike German industry and morale, all threatened by Germany's defensive innovations. But the British were innovating just as rapidly. They developed new navigation systems, G, then oboe, then H2S, that allowed bombers to find targets more accurately, even in complete darkness or cloud cover. They created the Pathfinder Force, elite crews who marked targets with colored flares, turning previously scattered raids into concentrated attacks that overwhelmed local defenses. They improved their bombers, particularly the Avro Lancaster, which could carry enormous bomb loads deep into German territory and absorb significant battle damage while still returning home. Most importantly, they developed operational research, systematic analysis of what worked and what didn't, statistical evaluation of tactics and technologies, institutional mechanisms for learning from experience. When a new German defensive tactic appeared, British operational research teams analyzed it, developed countermeasures, and distributed those countermeasures throughout Bomber Command. When loss rates varied by route or altitude or time, statistical analysis identified patterns and informed tactical adjustments. The system was explicitly designed to learn faster than the enemy, to adapt more quickly, to turn every failure into information that informed improvement. The development of Window, the aluminum foil strips that created false radar returns, exemplified this approach. British scientists understood that German radar worked by detecting radio waves reflected off metal objects. They reasoned that if you filled the sky with thousands of small pieces of metal, each creating its own radar return, you could overwhelm the system's ability to distinguish real targets from false ones. The technology was absurdly simple. Strips of aluminum foil cut to specific lengths, packaged in bundles, dropped from bombers by crew members, but the effect was devastating. When Window was first used over Hamburg in July 1943, German radar operators initially thought their equipment was malfunctioning. Their screens filled with returns, thousands of apparent targets where they knew only hundreds of bombers could possibly be. Fighter controllers could not direct night fighters toward real targets because they could not distinguish real returns from false ones. The entire defensive system, so painstakingly constructed, became nearly useless in the space of a single night. This should have triggered an immediate crisis response in German air defense. The countermeasures existed: different radar frequencies, visual searching tactics, concentration of fighters over likely targets rather than relying on radar guidance. But implementing these countermeasures required acknowledging that the current system had been defeated, that British technology had proven superior, that fundamental changes were necessary. This acknowledgement was politically impossible for Göring, who had staked his reputation on the Kammhuber line's invincibility. The result was a slow, grudging, inadequate response. Some countermeasures were eventually implemented, months after they should have been, with insufficient resources and inadequate coordination. The defensive system never recovered its previous effectiveness. German night fighters continued to shoot down bombers, sometimes in significant numbers, but never again at rates that threatened to make British operations unsustainable. The initiative had shifted permanently to the attackers. This shift exemplified a crucial principle of technological competition. Static defense guarantees eventual defeat. Any defensive system, no matter how sophisticated, creates a puzzle for attackers to solve. Once they solve it, the advantage shifts decisively, unless the defense can adapt faster than attackers can exploit the solution. The Kammhuber line was brilliant for its time, but for its time lasted about 18 months. After that, it needed continuous evolution to maintain effectiveness. Göring's belief that the system was a permanent solution rather than a temporary advantage doomed it to obsolescence. The underlying problem was epistemological, a failure to understand how knowledge works, how innovation happens, how organizations learn. The Nazi worldview assumed that German racial and cultural superiority would naturally produce technical and tactical dominance. When this dominance proved temporary, when Allied forces demonstrated superior capability, the ideological framework had no mechanism for processing this information. Rather than concluding that their assumptions were wrong, Nazi leaders concluded that their subordinates were insufficiently committed, that traitors were undermining German efforts, that the enemy was using unfair or illegitimate methods. This is magical thinking, the belief that reality will conform to desire if one simply believes hard enough or eliminates doubters. It is the opposite of the scientific method, which assumes that reality is indifferent to our preferences and that progress comes from accepting what evidence reveals, however uncomfortable that revelation might be. Military effectiveness requires the scientific method: rigorous analysis, honest assessment, adaptation based on evidence rather than ideology. Kammhuber represented the scientific method applied to air defense. Göring represented magical thinking. The collision between them was inevitable, and the outcome was predetermined by the system's structure. Magical thinking always wins in the short term because it controls the levers of power, can silence dissent, can enforce its version of reality through institutional authority. But reality always wins in the long term because it is not subject to political control, does not care about human preferences, operates according to physical laws rather than ideological principles. Germany lost the air war not because British and American forces were inherently superior, but because Allied institutions were better able to learn, adapt, and apply resources based on evidence rather than wishful thinking. The tragedy is that Germany possessed the technical capability and human resources to compete effectively. What it lacked was wisdom, the ability to accept uncomfortable truths, to adapt strategies when they stopped working, to prioritize effectiveness over appearance. This lack was structural, built into the nature of Nazi governance and therefore ultimately fatal. Josef Kammhuber survived the war. He was among the lucky ones, not killed in combat, not executed for defeatism, not destroyed in the final collapse of Nazi Germany. After the war, he was briefly detained by Allied authorities, questioned extensively about his role in German air defense, then released when investigators concluded he had been a professional soldier rather than a war criminal. His technical expertise, his focus on military effectiveness rather than ideological zeal, his eventual removal from positions of influence for challenging authority, all these factors worked in his favor during denazification proceedings. In an ironic twist that reveals much about how the world changed after 1945, Kammhuber was later recruited by the new German government in the 1950s to help rebuild the Luftwaffe as part of NATO. The Cold War created need for German rearmament, and NATO required officers with expertise in air defense, particularly defense against Soviet bomber forces that posed similar threats to those posed by the RAF and US AAF during the war. The man whose warnings had been rejected by Nazi leadership became a valued advisor to democratic governments, his insights about integrated air defense and radar networks forming part of the foundation for NATO's defensive posture. The expertise that had been dangerous in wartime became valuable in peacetime. The warnings that had gotten him exiled to Norway were vindicated by events and became the basis for post-war doctrine. The analysis that Göring had suppressed was studied in military academies as an example of what happens when political considerations override operational necessity. Kammhuber's career after 1945 demonstrated that his removal from command had been punishment for competence rather than consequence of incompetence. Wolfgang Falck likewise survived, living until 2007. His post-war life was less officially prominent than Kammhuber's, but perhaps more intellectually interesting. He became a historian of the night fighter war, writing extensively about the tactics, the technology, the men who flew and died in the dark skies over Europe. His memoirs and articles provided invaluable primary source material for historians trying to understand what had actually happened versus what official narratives claimed had happened. In his later years, Falck wrote about the meeting with Göring that ended his operational career. He described the moment he realized that Göring was not merely mistaken, but unreachable, that no amount of evidence would penetrate the Reichsmarshal's ideological certainty, that speaking truth was simultaneously necessary and futile. He wrote about the calculation he made, that even knowing his warnings would be ignored, even knowing he would be punished, he could not remain silent and still live with himself afterward. Falck did not express regret for what he said that day at Karinhal. He remained convinced throughout his life that speaking truth was the right choice, the only choice he could make without betraying himself and the men under his command. He acknowledged that it accomplished nothing tangible. The radar gaps were not fixed, the resources were not reallocated, the cities burned anyway. But he insisted that the moral value of the act existed independent of its practical consequences, that there is worth in refusing to participate in collective delusion, even when refusal is powerless to stop the delusion. This raises profound questions about moral action in corrupt systems. Was Falck right? If speaking truth accomplishes nothing, if the messenger is silenced and the message ignored, if the catastrophe happens anyway, what was the point? Would it have been better to remain silent, to preserve his position, to do what good he could within the system's constraints? Would strategic complicity have been more ethical than futile honesty? These questions have no easy answers, no formula that works in every situation. The utilitarian calculus suggests that preserving influence by staying silent might enable small improvements that speaking truth would preclude. If Falck had not confronted Göring, perhaps he could have remained in command, could have implemented tactical adjustments within his limited authority, could have saved at least some lives through competent leadership at operational levels. His removal meant that less capable officers took his place, officers more concerned with pleasing superiors than protecting their men. But this utilitarian calculation assumes that silence is cost-free, that complicity does not corrupt the complicit, that there is no moral hazard in knowing truth and hiding it. It assumes that being able to influence small things is worth the price of enabling large evils through silence. It assumes that preserving one's position is more important than preserving one's integrity. Falck's choice reflected a different ethical framework, one that might be called existentialist or deontological, depending on how it's articulated. He believed there are lines that cannot be crossed without losing oneself, that being able to look at oneself honestly matters more than being able to influence outcomes, that speaking truth has intrinsic value even when truth is ignored. This is a morality based not on consequentialism, but on authenticity, on the idea that we define ourselves through our choices, that meaning comes from how we act rather than what we accomplish, that dignity requires refusing to participate in lies even when such refusal seems pointless. Neither framework is obviously superior to the other. Both describe real ethical considerations that compete in situations of moral complexity. The tragedy is that such impossible choices should ever be necessary, that systems exist where doing good requires either complicity with evil or futile martyrdom. The lesson is not that individuals should embrace futile suffering as moral purity, but that societies should build institutions where such dilemmas are rare, where speaking truth is rewarded rather than punished, where expertise is valued rather than feared. The radar gap case endures as a teaching example in military academies, business schools, and courses on organizational behavior. Students learn about the danger of killing the messenger, about the cost of prioritizing hierarchy over truth, about how institutions fail when they cannot process negative feedback. The specific technologies involved, vacuum tube radar, piston engine night fighters, radio-directed interception, are long obsolete, museum pieces from an era of warfare fundamentally different from modern conflicts. But the institutional dynamics remain perpetually relevant. We see echoes of Kammhuber and Göring's confrontation in every corporate scandal preceded by ignored whistleblowers. In every financial crisis, where economists who warned about systemic risk were dismissed as pessimists or scaremongers. In every industrial accident that happened, despite engineers identifying the vulnerabilities that caused it. In every intelligence failure, where analysts who predicted threats were overruled by political appointees who found those predictions inconvenient. The names change, the technologies evolve, the specific circumstances vary, but the pattern remains constant. Expert identifies problem. Institutional culture rejects uncomfortable truth. Catastrophe follows. Expert is vindicated too late. Breaking this pattern requires more than good intentions or better people. It requires institutional structures that reward rather than punish truth-telling, that create paths for negative information to flow upward without filtering or distortion, that build redundancy and cross-checking into decision-making processes. It requires cultures that treat uncertainty as information rather than weakness, that see changing one's mind based on evidence as strength rather than inconsistency, that understand that being right is more important than appearing consistent. These structures and cultures are difficult to build and maintain. They run counter to natural human psychology, which prefers confirmation of existing beliefs to challenging them, which values loyalty to hierarchy over loyalty to truth, which punishes those who make us uncomfortable, even when their discomfort is justified. Creating institutions that overcome these tendencies is one of civilization's perpetual challenges and rare achievements. Democratic governance, scientific method, market competition, these are all institutional frameworks designed partly to overcome our natural resistance to negative information, to force consideration of alternatives, to reward adaptation over rigidity. But even these frameworks are imperfect and vulnerable. Democracies can become paralyzed by partisanship. Scientific consensus can be captured by groupthink. Markets can reward short-term profit over long-term sustainability. The battle between evidence and ideology, between learning and dogma, between adaptation and inertia is never permanently won. It must be fought repeatedly, in every institution, in every generation, because the forces that led to Kammhuber's silencing exist everywhere humans organize themselves hierarchically. The final judgment on Kammhuber's warning and Göring's rejection must consider what might have been. If Germany had addressed the radar gaps, if resources had been allocated to strengthening air defense, if tactical doctrine had evolved to emphasize flexibility over rigid zone control, would it have changed the outcome of the war? Almost certainly not fundamentally. By 1943, Germany's strategic position was hopeless, fighting the Soviet Union, Britain, and the United States simultaneously, while lacking the economic resources to sustain total war against such overwhelming combined industrial capacity. Better air defense might have inflicted higher losses on Allied bombing campaigns, might have forced adjustments in their tactics or timing, but it would not have addressed Germany's fundamental problems: overextension across multiple fronts, resource exhaustion, the impossibility of victory against enemies who collectively possessed vastly superior production capacity and manpower. Germany was losing the war not because of tactical failures like radar gaps, but because of strategic insanity, starting a war it could not win, refusing to seek negotiated peace when that might still have been possible, continuing to fight long after defeat was inevitable. What better air defense might have accomplished was limiting civilian casualties, reducing the destruction of German cities, giving German civilians some protection against the terror from the skies. These are not trivial considerations. Approximately 350,000 to 400,000 German civilians died in Allied bombing raids during the war. Entire city centers were reduced to rubble. Cultural treasures accumulated over centuries were destroyed in single nights. The psychological trauma affected an entire generation. Whether these casualties served meaningful military purpose is still debated by historians. German industrial production actually increased through most of 1944 despite intensive bombing. suggesting that the campaign failed in its stated objective of crippling Germany's war economy. German civilian morale did not break. If anything, bombing may have strengthened resolve rather than weakened it. The resources Allied nations devoted to strategic bombing, the aircraft, the crew training, the bomb production, might have produced greater military effect if allocated differently, perhaps to tactical air support or to anti-submarine warfare. The moral calculus is complex and contested, but from the perspective of German leaders' responsibilities to their own people, the failure to address air defense vulnerabilities was a profound betrayal. Nazi ideology promised protection, dominance and security to the German people. What it delivered was death from above, cities in ruins, children burned in firestorms, populations terrorized while their leaders blamed them for insufficient faith in promised victory. Kammhuber tried to prevent this. He saw the vulnerabilities, analyzed them systematically, and presented solutions that were technically feasible and operationally sound. His analysis was ignored, not because it was wrong, but because it was right in ways that threatened Göring's position and contradicted Nazi narratives about German superiority. Göring's vanity and ideological blindness made effective defense impossible, and German civilians paid the price. This is perhaps the most damning indictment of authoritarian systems. They treat their own populations as resources to be exploited rather than citizens to be protected. When protecting people requires admitting mistakes, authoritarian leaders choose their own prestige over their people's lives. When effectiveness requires acknowledging limitations, they choose comfortable lies over uncomfortable adaptations. The Nazi regime epitomized this pathology, but the pathology is not unique to Nazism. Any system that concentrates power without accountability, that eliminates checks on authority, that criminalizes dissent, will eventually sacrifice its people to protect its rulers' images. The story of the radar gaps is not ultimately about radar or gaps, or even about air defense. It is about what happens when institutions become divorced from reality, when authority becomes its own justification, when power insulates itself from truth. It is about the courage required to speak truth to power, and the tragedy that such courage so often accomplishes nothing. It is about how easily expertise is discarded, how readily facts are denied, how predictably catastrophe follows when institutions prioritize comfort over reality. On this day in November 2025, as we look back across more than 8 decades since that meeting at Karen Hall, the lesson remains urgently relevant. We live in an age of climate change denial despite overwhelming scientific consensus, of vaccine misinformation despite mountains of medical evidence, of algorithmic manipulation that exploits cognitive biases, of institutional complexity that exceeds most people's ability to comprehend. We are surrounded by experts warning about problems, institutional resistance to uncomfortable truths, and the recurring pattern of catastrophe preceded by ignored warnings. The temptation remains always the same: to shoot the messenger, to deny the problem, to double down on existing approaches, because admitting error feels like weakness. The wisdom remains equally constant: to listen, to adapt, to accept that being wrong is survivable, but refusing to acknowledge being wrong is fatal. This wisdom is difficult, uncomfortable, and essential. It is what separates learning institutions from dying institutions, functional societies from failing ones, progress from collapse. Josef Kammhuber warned Hermann Göring about radar gaps in early 1943. Within 48 hours, he was silenced, removed from command, exiled to irrelevance. German cities burned. Hundreds of thousands died. The warning was right. The silencing changed nothing except to make catastrophe inevitable. This is what happens when truth becomes treason. This is the price of institutional vanity. This is why we must remember the man who warned the moment he spoke, and the 48 hours that sealed Germany's fate in the skies over Europe. Not because it changes the past, which is fixed and beyond our reach, but because it might yet change the future. If we finally learn what history keeps trying to teach us, if we build institutions capable of hearing truth even when truth is uncomfortable, if we value survival over pride and adaptation over appearance. The radar gaps were real. The warning was ignored. The consequences were catastrophic. The lesson endures.